Hi, Camilla. Hi, Jason.
Hey,
Hello.
I have this problem every live stream. Like we're doing it like pretty much every week. So when the countdown goes, I sit and hum, and I never know when it's going to finish. And I'm always worried that one day we will start and I'll be humming, and that'll be really unpleasant for all involved.
no, that would be great. I think you should. So, like I told you in a previous episode, like I'm usually like dancing to the music or something, and then all serious when we come on.
So serious. Okay, so next time maybe we should like have a trio dance.
I think everybody wants to see that.
Everybody wants to see that. That's what you got involved into, Camilo. Little did you know the madness unfolds.
Absolutely.
Anyway, well, we're back, and now we're finally reading books, which is very, very exciting.
Yeah, today we start discussing the books that everybody helped us choose. So thanks again for everybody for voting on the polls on Twitter and stuff. We definitely didn't choose any light reading for everybody. And our first book, I think, has certainly for me expanded my mind and caused me some trouble with my brain. And so we're starting our discussions today. In our first episode with Camilo, we talked about the importance of critical theory, and maybe what we might say is a lack of critical engagement with this kind of theory in disaster studies, and that's kind of the impetus for our reading and our conversations. And we've also talked about the importance of reading outside of our field, and I think hopefully everybody participating finds this to be a healthy exercise. I certainly wouldn't trade it. I'm so grateful that I started to read outside of my field. And so for the next 4 episodes, the 3 of us and some other guests are going to discuss the books that you helped us choose earlier in the year.
Yeah. And this is really exciting. So hopefully we will have guests joining us later today. We had some technical issues, but let's see. Might be a surprise. But anyhow, so the first book that you all helped us choose was Malcolm Ferdinand's. You can see it, right? Decolonial Ecology: Thinking from the Caribbean World. So let's start. We have a lot to talk about. We had a quick chat about it as we were preparing for this live stream. And I guess it would be great if Camilo, who made the suggestion to include this book, so we all blame Camilo for our heads hurting today. So could you tell us a bit more about the book and why you thought it would be a great fit for this season?
Okay, thanks. Thank you, especially for the blaming role that I have, which is very nice and good. Thank you. It's where to start? For several reasons. The first encounter is very personal. The first encounter I have with the book was an original interview in a blog, actually, when the French edition was out. And I remember that Malcolm Ferdinand was kind of interviewed in an exchange blog when the first version was out in 2019, so quite earlier. And I remember that I was captured with the blog for 2 reasons. The first reason was the title. Very basic, and the title, I think, is a sort of very interesting position or statement in relation to what we were discussing last time on the need to expand, provincialize, include other forms of epistemologies and knowledge in relation to critical theory in general, and specifically critical disaster studies more specifically. So the provincialization, start what Malcolm says, start thinking from the Caribbean, and actually from the hurricanes of the Caribbean, as actually a very logical, very physical, but also very historical tempest, which is a metaphor that he used in the book. It's, for me, one of the reasons why I found very interesting in this book. Now, whether the connection with the disaster is kind of metaphorical, if you want, but it's also very specific for the territorial compositions of the Caribbean per se. The second reason of the decolonial option of the critique, which is a deliberate action, has to me related to the fact that he overlaps directly, without hesitation, critical racial studies and a critique of colonial thinking, periodization, histories, Black life, literature. So the origin and the responsibility of colonial, in addition, overlapping with environmental dimension that are tangible too. So what we know now in the literature connected with the Plantaocene, the Capitalocene, so all these Anthropocene versions of the critique. And I found it that in the text, he did it kind of very deliberately and very usefully, overlapping two very different fields of research and study. Of course, in a very engaging prose, in a very fantastic organization of the book. So the reason actually was a fascination for the composition of a possible interesting word. And the third reason probably is again around the title, which is again the use of ecology, which I think in both disaster studies and critical thinking is again a very fundamental component of an arena of reflection. So in a way, moving from environment to ecology, moving from space to relation, moving from being to entanglement as a sort of more diverse scalar responsibility, ethics, and politics, for me remain, a fundamental component or perimeter of critical thinking whatsoever. So those were the three kind of reasons why, for me, was a very interesting suggestion, and I'm glad that you and the public and the audience have helped us to, to select at least as a first discussion.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm glad that you chose it. I have heard about this book before, but it kind of just didn't make it to my bookshelf somehow, among all the other books. And then after you mentioned it, I ended up with 2 copies, as you do, right? So JC Gaillard benefited from my greed of book buying. Jason, so what did you think as you read it?
I share a problem with book buying with you, Ksenia, obviously.
No.
I have several, multiple copies of things because, I buy things, from Verso or Haymarket, and then I end up getting second copy from the books club subscription, right? Anyway, these are the problems we deal with.
We face, yeah.
I thought it's an incredible book, and it just really just made me think every page. There's so many concepts in there, and I really like the way that Malcolm Ferdinand used italics to highlight important concepts, to focus my attention on certain things. I thought that was really really helpful for me to navigate the book, because it's a very deep and intense reflection. The way that he uses theory and metaphor and story is part of what makes it hard to process, but it's rich, So I didn't mind the fact that it was hard, and I'm gonna have to read it again probably several times to fully grasp some of the connections and the metaphors. The metaphor of the ship, I just really appreciated the different types of ship, and the way that he built towards this idea of a world ship, from the metaphor of Noah's Ark and the slave ship. I just thought really fit in well to the theory that he was trying to build, and the kind of analytical framework that he was working with. And I need to spend more time with the figures, but things like this figure, I don't know if you can see.
What page? Tell
for
us.
the world ship.
Table, yeah.
Yeah, the table from 203.
Yeah.
I think that he has several of those through the book that are really helpful. And I would like to spend more time with. But the use of diagram, the use of metaphor, I think just really invite readers to like think creatively and like get into the vibe of the book and kind of lose yourself in exploring. And I think another thing that's struck me was the way that he was challenging how we got here, and he was challenging modernity, and the way that we form disciplines and the way that we form canons of literature and genealogies. And he did that in a way by critiquing, you know, how we got to the way we talk about environmentalism and the way that we talk about ecology in the mainstream, and how that kind of fits with a Western Northern narrative, about kind of the purity of nature and so on, going back to like Thoreau and like exploring that nature in that sense of kind of pristine wilderness, and how we're still kind of attached to that, and he builds into that like the narrative of Noah's Ark being kind of very dominant, you know. And I like the politics of that, and he talks about the politics of boarding, and then on the other hand, the politics of disembarkation. So there's just so much in there that's like new to me, that is incredible. But I just want to finish with like talking about at the end of the book where he actually has a very hopeful take on a world shift, and how he kind of connects all of these injustices and all of these ways of thinking that are perpetuating the same problems, into a very hopeful narrative in the final part of the book, which is really to just talking about how we can form a new relationship with the earth. Like he talks about inhabitation, new ways of inhabiting, and which is based on some of the stuff that we talk about all the time, about care and about solidarity, and about shared vulnerabilities, you know, and vulnerability as potential. And then he just kind of leaves you with some questions about how do people who have been oppressed come into relationship with their oppressors. And to me, that links back to some of the other things we're going to talk about with Freire. But those are big questions, and there's no easy answers. But for me, it leaves me with so much to think about. I really appreciated the book, even if some of it was just, I need to get back to it on a second read.
Yeah, I mean, I concur. You know, this book, as I started reading, it kind of really broke my brain. You know, but like in a good way. I will need to go back to it, as Jason, you said it, and kind of read it again and again, to really comprehend it. And I had to read every single word, every single sentence, which I don't do normally, right? I'm a fast reader. I'm very much a skim reader, and this book certainly didn't allow for that. Because it is so engaging and it is so deep. And I kept wondering what it's like to read it in French. So if any of you in the audience have read this book in French, please let us know. I'm just so curious, you know, how much the translation has violated what Ferdinand had to say originally, and what the differences would be. It's kind of something that the idea of translation really fascinates me. And also what I really appreciate is that I felt that he really highlighted the Caribbean, in a sense that this is where the globalization in its capitalist sense has become, right? In kind of that globalization that is based on racism, that is still so prominent today. And first of all, what really captured me before I even started reading the book is, of course, the cover. And so here Ferdinand uses Turner's picture called Slave Ship. And this is the painting of the massacre that took place on the zone in 1781. And of course, I had to go and research all about this painting, because I was really quite curious to understand why that was the cover for the book. And so what happened is basically the crew anticipated a water shortage, because due to different navigation errors there, the trip has been extended. And the slavers, as probably most of you know, they had kind of an insurance called Perils of Sea, which compensated their loss. And that loss included enslaved people in case of extreme weather events, right? Or it was kind of, basically it was more economically beneficial for the slavers to throw the enslaved people overboard than to share the remaining supplies of water with them. And so more than 140 enslaved people were murdered. And this is what this painting, right, and this cover captures. And I love how Ferdinand makes a parallel between this painting, the Turner's painting, and the climate crisis that all of us are facing, right? So have we decided, or are we deciding to just be selfish and protect our own interests, right? And just enjoy the supplies that we have now, enjoy our lifestyle, even if it means that we sacrifice everything around us and everyone around us. And then, of course, this whole idea of the storm, right, that Camilo said this already, that has shaped the history of modernity along a double fracture. And so this idea of double fracture captured me, really captured my imagination. So on one hand, we have this environmental fracture that is driven by technocratic kind of capitalist civilization, right? And that keeps adding to the ongoing climate crisis, keeps adding to kind of ongoing devastation. And then on the other hand, we have a colonial fracture, which is of course instilled by Western colonialism, by Western imperialism, and resulted in slavery and domination. And if I may, because I'll always do so, I just want to read this paragraph that was kind of wow for me. And this is from the chapter called The Colonial Hurricane. It's the end of this chapter, the end of part 1. The colonial hurricane shows that the ecological crisis is not a complete re-examination of the world. On the contrary, it reinforces colonial domination and oppression. Hurricanes accelerate the world, contract it, stretch it, and reveal its structural fractures, as well as radicalize its lines of non-sharing, lines which differentiate with whom the world is shared and with whom it is not shared. Yes, climate change is the consecration of the prosperous of the world, those who profit from disasters, and the continuation of the suffering for the Calibans and the Ariels of the earth. As described by Cicero and Shakespeare, the climatic tempest is born out of the master's exploitation of the enslaved through a capitalist production laden with greenhouse gases, which widens social inequalities and perpetuates injustices that are openly admitted to. So what ship are we going to build in the face of the storm? And that, you know, when I read that, I was just like, wow, this is perhaps the best summary of what is happening with us now and how we could act on it. So yeah, thanks, Camilo, for choosing the book.
No, thank you. Let me, if I can, the two issues. The first one is again, I love what is happening, which is reading through and within and with other people, and this gesture of collective reading, even if this from a distance, even if it's in different time zone, it's is a truly privilege to think with other people, the author specifically, but also with all the audience, yourself. And I think this coming back to the text is also not a sign of limitation, but actually is one way of enriching the readings that we are having. So the reading, the deep reading, is not an extractive, if you want, way of engaging with literature and thinking, but is really a collective. I mean, Fred and Harney and Modern use in the Undercommon this idea of the study rather than the reading as a more deep engaging with text and reflection, which I do believe actually is what we're doing actually, or attempting to do, or actually eventually suggesting to our students or the people who works with us, which is to study, to engage with others, people thinking, and actually thanking for them. We'll see that in others. option. So I absolutely agree with what you said. Let me say that just because you started with the cover and with the Zong and with Turner, which, by the way, the book is all full of aesthetics references to poetry. For those who haven't read it, there is a moment in which each chapter is opened with the name of a ship.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not only I think, a very powerful archival construction of a different archive of thinking, both historical, but also to reposition that centrality of the colonial, the Black Atlantic trade and the colonial as a fundamental historical gesture. This is connected with other works like, Deepak Chakrabarty or Christina Sharp or Alex Willander. So there is a numbers of new literature that reposition what matter as the beginning of the story and the horizon of an historical reflection outside Europe, outside the conventional Western thinking. And this is absolutely fundamental. Again, the colonial in nature, critical as the logic. But there is numbers of others, the reference to the painting, Turner specifically, and others. There was a word maybe that is worth to mention, which is the ships. I think is more than a metaphor. The ship to me is kind of a figure, both historical, and this is very fundamentally historical, but also it's kind of a door, an entrance, I don't know, to define is the way Ferdinand entered the story and enter to the environment, to the ecology. It's kind of a door, right? It's kind of a place where he tell us a story and actually construct a very convincing, I would say, story. So the ship is actually, to me, something very, not only very physical, but also very historical. So it's beyond the metaphorical dimension. I found it that whether the tempest probably is more an affective dimension that he tried to connect with, the crisis, and you rendered absolutely. Let me maybe cite a word I have towards the end in the epilogue. He says something that I found extremely interesting, and he says, "The modern tempest is still raging, and the ship reproduced the same gesture as the Zong, the cover, abandoning, enslaving, or throwing overboard the part of earth and humanity," which is what you were seeing. And later she says, "To the environmental urgency that will limit global warming and halt the destruction of the earth ecosystem, I, Ferdinand, ask this equally urgent action: global retribution of wealth and social justice, the decolonial task of recognizing a dignified place in the world for first people and those who were formerly colonized, racialized, and third, an equal and social political consideration for women, especially women of color of former European ecology." So yes, ecology is above all an issue of justice. And this intersectionality, to a certain extent, which fit very well with the GRIP project around which we are all constructing this dimension, but also a fundamental intersectionality as a gesture of critical thinking. So beyond discipline, beyond historical regimes or horizon, beyond geographical dimension, and beyond cultural or intellectual tropes that we are used. So the ecological crisis as a crisis of justice is to me a very fundamental dimension that opens a lot of interesting readings to the disaster studies per se, which normally are technocratic, normally are problem-oriented, less intersectional to a certain extent. We do believe has another door or another entry point for a fruitful discussion, of course.
I think it's really interesting how you describe the sheep as a kind of as a door, right? And I haven't thought about this. I really like this parallel. But I also felt in some places, particularly when it's kind of the parallels with Noah's Ark, right? that the sheep is that Western savior that is there to save, and I use quotation marks, the environment, right? Because it will come and it will choose whom to save, right? Be that people or species, humans or species, because such is our privilege, right? As the West. And I found that quite disturbing as I was reading the book, because I must admit I wasn't familiar with all the literature that Ferdinand refers to. Of course, kind of Shakespeare's more or less given, but some of it was quite challenging, so I had to go and read up on this. But Noah's metaphor is well known, and thinking about it through the way that he describes the crisis, and through the way that he describes kind of coloniality and decoloniality, made it much more sinister, I think, in my eyes.
Yeah.
I think it's also like the blindness to that as well, that we see all around us, and like the dominant narratives around like both disaster and climate change. Like coming back to what you said, Senja, about the tempest, like I think it not only applies to how we talk about the climate crisis, but it applies to narratives about disaster and what's really happening, both in terms of the risk that's being created, but also like who benefits in the recovery, and who even benefits from the tempest itself, right? Because in the examples that Ferdinand was using, there was clear beneficiaries in like creating the tempest. There was a function to it. It served certain interests, and we see that in disasters too. That not everybody is very disappointed in a disaster event, right? But at the same time, in the aftermath of a disaster, in a recovery stage, we know that it's not the people who need it the most that benefit, or who recover, or who get access to the most recovery resources. Yeah, I think that's a really powerful narrative in this, and it's really closely linked to what we all study, and many of our listeners who are in different disaster studies domains.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of I guess many people asked us as we were doing the selection for the books, right? What is the relevance to disaster studies? And that was the whole point of the exercise, to read out. But actually, as I started reading this book, I felt that this could be a disaster studies textbook, right? That kind of all students of disaster scholarship should read, and scholarship and praxis, because we know that disasters and social oppression always go hand in hand, right? They're inseparable, that they're always together. But yet we urge to tackle disasters, right? To reduce disaster risk, using the slogans that are kind of devoid of social thought, like build back better, be resilient. I don't know what else. We can come up with millions of slogans, right? That there is no social cohesion, there is no social thought. And this, of course, allows, and we discussed it so many times before, this kind of cooptation of the environmental, I guess, imperative, and also, but instead it advocates for a very technocratic, very top-down response. So we are going to combat disaster risk, right? And we will do it through, I don't know, geoengineering. I'm just making it up. Everybody knows that I have no idea about geoengineering. And so, but basically what to me this book kind of really showed, in the context of thinking about it from disaster studies point of view, is that we can really get caught in a very technocratic reading of a disaster as a problem, right? And so what we then do is we offer the solution that completely ignores the other, as in kind of a subaltern, right? To use Gramsci's word here. because we never stop and ask what the subalterns actually want. So do they want the land to be decontaminated? And I'm using an example that Ferdinand uses quite a lot here, right? Does this mean decontamination of the land, a justice that they were fighting for, right? Or do they just want to change the way that lands are actually inhabited, and that should have had happened 500 years ago? So Camilo, what do you think? Like, how do you kind of frame this book from disaster studies point of view?
I think I couldn't do better than what is written in the forewords. And let's remember that the English version of the book has a forewords of Angela Davis. Everybody knows. In the very opening of the forewords, which is more than a praise of the book, is really what I found it interesting. To answer your question, I'm reading. Whoever recognizes how entangled we are in the chaos of contemporary racial capitalism with its hetero-patriarchal contours, and whoever is attempting to imagine emancipatory future in ways that do not privilege a single component of the crisis, will greatly benefit from spending time with the text. Ferdinand call us on to embrace holistic method of inquiry and response to crisis, grounded into the interdependency that constitute all of us, plants, human and other animals, the soil, the ocean, while recognizing that racism has deposited white supremacy at the very hearth of our notion of the human. I think this is for me, is somehow a possible link with kind of an agenda, if you want, of the disaster study. So intersectionality, no problem for sure, definitely go ahead. But also this idea of post-humanism in a broader sense. Disasters are often lacking, or more recently trying to engage with all the debate about post-humanism, and definitely more with the social justice debate, specifically from a number of geographies that we know. But I do believe that is certainly an element, but also methodologically, I would say. And I think, part of the books of Remember Me, part of the book of Mimi Scheller on the island in disasters always in the Caribbean. Remember Me reading some points of Edouard Glissant on the opacity in the island. I think that there are numbers of connection. But why methodologically? Because methodologically engage with unsaid story or overlooked stories, and also mixing different sources of the form. The fact that we often overly rely on social science methods versus others' method, being historical, being visual, being artistic or creative. I think the multi-methodology of the inquiry around disasters, the aftermaths, and the constructions of socio-spatial vulnerabilities, to me, remain very, very central. So it's kind of a suggestion of how to do it. Probably we won't be able to do it as well as Malcolm Ferdinand does, but certainly opening for that direction. And a third, maybe point, which is probably more close to my scholarship and what I'm interested in, is that he definitely used part of the word that I'm using, which is the word of inhabitation rather than habitat or space. He drew definitely on Heidegger version of inhabiting in a more complex, becoming, earthed dimension. But that I found it extremely interesting. Inhabiting, the crisis is a way of finding relation, and the relation with the problem. He cited Donna Haraway a couple of times in this entanglement dimension. But this notion of inhabitation, and basically he has this kind of framework of a colonial inhabitation towards a decolonial inhabiting. I found it extremely interesting, because you cannot call for a decolonial critique without calling for a different future. You have actually to dig in the past to highlight elements of that possibility. So different archive for a different futures, not different future with the same archive, which I found extremely interesting, especially for as people like me studying more territorial, spatial, architectural, or urban condition. So yes, the connections are probably not so evident, although for a rapid reader, the Caribbean, the hurricane is also connected very directly with the disaster. He cite and work with Katrina hurricane directly, connecting specifically that point that Jason was making about the who gained for and from, and the inequality of that. So I agree with you. Is a very interesting. And let me close with something that I found it interesting, which is the series of the book where Polity, which is the publisher that published the book, is very interesting. Is titled Critical South. So use the word critical, which are all thinking about, but also displays the notion of critical from a Southern perspective, from a perspective of the South, which is not a geography, by the way, but is a way of looking, the situatedness dimension of that version, which I, again, think for many of us, this is a source of inspiration of how to engage with different territorial and conceptual articulation of work, and reinforce the idea that decolonial is a form of criticism among the many, among different traditions, but certainly is one way of engaging with the framework of a critical reflection.
I think that's so true. And for disaster scholarship, it's an important thing to reflect on, because a lot of the scholarship is very, Eurocentric, North-centric, white, and so we have a lot of work to do to deconstruct like why that is, and challenge it, and do the work, right? And I think there's a lot of pushback to that from like the kind of dominant disciplines, even professors and so on, because that's threatening to the power structure. And so, but it's encouraging to see people making inroads on that, and putting some challenges forward, including through radix and other mechanisms. One thing I wanted to read something from the world ship section, because it just really it connected with like a lot of stuff that I'm thinking about vulnerability, and that we're writing about, Ksenia. And he's talking about forming a body in the world, and just to connect this with what you were saying, Camillo, about inhabitation. Earlier in the book, he was talking about how, the possibility of co-inhabitation was taken off the table, in a plantation situation. And so there was a possibility for co-inhabitation with other Christians, but that was the limit. Like, we may have our disagreement, but we're fellow Christians, like colonists, and slavers. But co-inhabitation with those who are enslaved was not even a possibility. But Malcolm Ferdinand comes back to the world ship idea, and I'm reading from page 207. And he says, I quote, "Forming a body in the world means acting in light of how our vulnerabilities are interdependent, and transforming the global institutions and economics that collectively impose, in a sense, a way of consuming the earth and not living together. From school canteens to supermarkets, from public energy politics to public transportation, from international agreements on the import and export of agricultural products, to national contracts of arms sales, to import policies for uranium and other minerals. Acting in the world is the path to finding our bodies again. This collective action allows us to form a body, to recover our bodies in the misogynistic and racist nets of the world, and to protect them from the environmental injuries of a plantation economy guided by a globalized capitalist market." And so like I said earlier, it's like a hopeful, aspirational view towards what we can achieve when we recognize our interdependencies. But all of that, I think it's quite wonderful, is built on this very cutting critique of the current things that we're trying to do to, like, quote unquote, like, save ourselves or to save the planet, you know, and how that's not really getting us any closer to recognizing our interdependencies, right?
Yeah, and that is the last sentence, right, of the world ship before the epilogue. The world ship, carried by yesterday's struggles, the rigging of today's world ship allows us to draw the horizon of a world of tomorrow. And that is such a beautiful, kind of hopeful future, right, that we can achieve. But will we, right? This is going back to this kind of to that double fracture. Are we selfish enough not to enjoy, right, that kind of the horizons of tomorrow, and looking at how things unfold? I think we are. And Camilo, you were talking about the kind of the space and temporal aspects and the boundaries, and that made me think about the chapter where Ferdinand writes about the violence of the blank pages, right? The kind of the paradise, what we call now, from our kind of Western eyes, that were in fact destroyed to be created into a paradise. And he writes, and so this is the chapter, Paradise or Hell in the Nature Preserves, that so-called paradise is established by expulsion from the world, while nature reserves are important tools in a panoply of ecological action. They are transformed into hell as soon as they're cleared of worldly concerns. Environmentalism, which focuses only on what happens within the boundaries of the reserves, therefore finds itself at an impasse. It conceals the world, the very world that made these reserves necessary. And that description of the boundaries that captures the disaster, right, as it kind of unfolds in that one temporary space, as we see it, I feel is just so strong, because we, perhaps in disasters, this is where the problem is, right? We put too many boundaries, but we don't understand how these boundaries, or we don't want to understand who enforces these boundaries and why they're there in the first place.
Yeah, you're right. No, I agree, but I think this goes back to this. I found this double fraction, put it in this way, and I think the metaphor or the logic of the double fraction is still remain in our very present. I think that is super, or if you want, the ambivalence of this double fraction of tension between the saving and the sharing, between the construction of garden and the construction of paradise and hell. I think that remain a very fundamental gesture of our current present. I do believe that the tension between this Promethean forward solution driven dimension is certainly one of the rhetorical or the discursive dimension that we're having. Therefore, the double fraction is, for me, again, is living that ambivalence, but also is being aware that you are always in the fault of, going there. So there's not only a process towards emancipation, the conventional critical theory logic of Frankfurt. You have a solution, you hope for a better future, technological, modern, safe, and so on. But you always have to come with the different narratives to the present. And I think that double fraction, I mean, the book constructed as a double fraction, again, reduce the force of man in general, or the force of intellect, the prophets, the philosopher, the writer, the technician, the disaster management, you name it, the man in that sense. And I think that is to me, find very interesting. Although there is probably, if just to make a very kind of possible critique, there is one of the chapter where he, I think, is engaged into this plants, animal, new alliances towards the end. I think it's chapter 12. which is very fascinating, very interesting, but then goes back to the justice paradigm. Towards the conclusion. And so intellectually, or is it justice or a different forms of justice and coexistence that we have to look, and how the justice paradigm is connected with a sort of multi-species logic. What I found it interesting is that he kind of refused the logic of restitution. I mean, this doesn't work. Restitute what, to whom, where? So the restitution is kind of a safe place, a safe haven, again constructed by. And I think it's very interesting, this kind of ambivalence towards the end. I wonder what would be the next book that an author like this would write after a book like this one. I'm very, if we would never have an opportunity to ask to Malcolm Ferdinand what he's working on now after this so powerful, engaging book, I would be very curious to know what's the next, especially because Foucault was saying that you end one book and you start with another one, and the one you start is always connected with the one that you have just finished. Very poetic way of saying that you work on one thing and you normally try to connect and doing only one. I'm very curious to know what Malcolm is doing, because I think the trajectory that he paved methodologically, intellectually, but also the double fraction as a gain of ambivalence of the present, I think put us in a different, more vulnerable, just to use Jason's word, position also ourselves. So not having a solution, or living with a different arrogance of the solution, put it in this way.
Indeed. Well, hopefully there will be a next book soon,
I'm sure.
and hopefully we'll get an opportunity to get together and discuss it, because this is a lot of fun. Thank you so much again. Thank you, Camilo, for suggesting this book, and thank you to the audience for helping us choose this book. It's been wonderful. I agree with you wholeheartedly in that reading book as a kind of collective exercise is somewhat much more fulfilling, and it makes me personally realize a lot of things that I perhaps couldn't grasp on my own, and it's that is the power of discussion. So thank you both for indulging me today. It's been wonderful. And so before we finish, just let me remind you about the books that we are going to read in the next few weeks. So in 2 weeks' time, we are reading Max Liboiron's Pollution is Colonialism. So that's on the 14th of September, when Camilo is back again with us. And Naomi Gonzalez Bautista will hopefully join us as well to discuss this book. We will then be discussing Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of Indignation, and we will finish this sub-series, I guess, with Silvia Federici's Patriarchy of the Wage. So if you haven't started reading those books, do read them. They're short but powerful. They do require some thought, as this book has required. And also, we also want to know what you are reading. And so please join our audience episode and tell us about your favorite book. Send us a short audio clip, and Jason and I will include it in our wrap-up episode, which will come out in the end of October. And as always, follow us on Twitter and on any podcast apps. These episodes are now gradually being released as audio episodes. So thank you, Jason, for doing that. And we hope you enjoy season 7. See you in a couple of weeks. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Malcolm. Bye-bye.